One of the things that we're doing updates on this afternoon is what was known as Voluntary Herd Certification Program. Now is the voluntary name has been dropped off, but I believe that's a permanent change, is it not?
Not quite effective yet.
Not quite effective yet, but is to be coming. Anyway, it gives me pleasure to introduce their program administrator, Corlena Patterson, right? Sorry, I'm having brain cramps today. And she's going to give us a short update on changes that are coming to the program. So with that, I'll turn over the podium.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to lull you into a nap with my presentation on the Herd Certification Program. So Randy alluded to the fact that his presentation wasn't going to be exciting earlier. I assure you mine will not be. I'm talking about program regulations, and it's impossible to make that sexy. But anyway, do my best. Lots of words, and we'll go through it. It's very similar in nature to the presentation I provided last year with respect to the program. The rules have not changed since that presentation, although they are expected to shortly. So we'll do a zip through of what the program elements are. I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea of what is being proposed for changes to the program, as well as some insight to what I understand to be the CFIA's changes to compensation for enrolled versus non-enrolled herds. So as I stated earlier, I don't work for the government. I am the buffer zone between all of you guys and the CFIA. So be nice, because I don't make the program rules. I don't have always a lot of influence over what becomes of changes for program rules, so I'm happy to listen to what you would like to have changed, as long as we can manage the expectations that I can't necessarily make that happen. Okay, so I'm welcome to listen to angry people, which is usually what this presentation generates after a while, and do what I can to help. And so we took over this program from Saskatchewan a little over a year ago. I mean take over as in we started delivering the still named the Voluntary Herd Certification Program. At the same time that we took over the administration for that program, the program rules changed almost simultaneously. So there's some, I know in some people's minds those kind of are one single event, and they aren't. They're two different events. The fact that the rules were going to change were in part, Betty, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but why not only Saskatchewan but some other jurisdictions decided to opt out of administering the program. They started to become very complex, and maybe there's more to it than that. That's my understanding. And so those happen simultaneously. It's not a new program. Folks who were on the voluntary program previously now get that. This is in fact the same program with new rules and some upcoming rule changes. And some history, not on the slides. I'm already slowing us down by not even getting to slide one. But I work for the Canadian Sheep Federation. So the question is, why the heck would we be delivering the Cervid program? But it is in part because the program continues to be very much modeled after the voluntary Scrapie Certification Program, which interestingly enough just dropped the voluntary out of its name too. We called it the Scrapie Certification Program. So we do that nationally for the sheep and goat sectors, and those programs are modeled closely after each other. So we had been administering the Cervid program in Ontario for about a decade, and Manitoba for about 5 or 6 years. Recently, we assumed the program administration from the government of Saskatchewan and as well from the government of Quebec. So we now do Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. Program rules are the same for everybody, even for those sectors that we don't administer. So that's why the heck we do it. So again, I work for industry, not government. I'll say that about 3 more times before we go through this program. So let's talk about the program elements as we know them now, as they changed as of April 1 of last year. It's built, the national standards 4-pillar program pillars are maintenance of accurate, complete inventory records in which all cervids are accounted for, ongoing tests of deaths and slaughter cervids, limited acquisitions to enrolled cervids of an equivalent or higher status, and implementing the VHCP biosecurity measures, soon to be HCP biosecurity measures. And I like to indicate, these as their own biosecurity measures. They are really encompassed in the biosecurity plan and standard itself that you discussed earlier, but they're actually less comprehensive than what you were shown earlier today. And they're really focused around the biosecurity relevant to chronic wasting disease. There's more that biosecurity does chronic wasting disease is one of those issues that it helps manage or mitigate risk, but a larger standard mitigates additional risks. So let's talk about the requirements under the program. For inventories, all cervids on the premises must be included in enrollment and on the inventory regardless of ownership. So you can't have a situation where you have the farm and you own a large number of animals, but somebody else has got some animals mixed in there or housed on the farm and have those as separate. And it's the same for the sheep and the goat programs. Every cervid on the farm has to be included in that enrollment and treated as such. Before 12 months of age, these animals have to be identified in a way that allows inventory tracking, so one form of ID at least that allows you to distinguish them from others. And animals 12 months of age or older require 2 unique IDs. One must be a provincial mandated ID if we're talking about Saskatchewan. So different jurisdictions have different ID requirements. In Saskatchewan, as a producer, one of those is going to have to be the provincially mandated tag. And not to add to the confusion, because it's confusing in my mind too, and sometimes, is that you guys will be subject to a national ID program when and if traceability regulations ever come into force. I'm not sure how familiar folks in the cervid industry are, and I'm also not entirely familiar with what forms of ID have been settled on for the use in that traceability program for cervids. I know Ian sits on those committees, so he's quite familiar. So just keep in mind that you'll see traceability regulations change with some requirement for national ID in there, and I don't know if for Saskatchewan that means an assumption that a Saskatchewan ID then becomes a national ID. Is that the premise? Or not?
The federal ID will be one of the approved provincial IDs,
okay.
But we are not going to get rid of our provincial case as well.
Okay, I'm not going to confuse it further for today's purposes. If they're 12 months of age or older, 2 IDs, one of those, the official provincial ID. Basic data, when you're conducting an inventory report to be submitted, and I'm going to talk about all of the submissions for an enrollment or advancement package a little bit later, but when you're doing an inventory report for your farm to be submitted for the purposes of program participation, you need to collect some basic data. So the species, very specifically, especially if you, well, we need to know what species it is, but if there's 2 species on any one farm, that would be important to know. The individual IDs, we talked about IDs just in the previous slide, the sex of the animal, the date of birth, or the date it entered the herd, available in the format of a month or a year, not necessarily down to the day, although that would be very important information to have just in case. And whether the source of that animal is a homegrown animal, a purchased animal, or a loaned animal. Inventory reports. Physical inventories are required for program participation on an annual basis. Well, inventories are. And physical inventories, that's when a veterinarian, accredited veterinarian, an official vet, which is a provincial or CFIA vet, or a game farm investigator verifies for you, have to be visually looked at on both forms for each animal on the inventory in the enrollment year. Cervids 12 months and older, individually inspected, and IDs verified under 12 months, counted and recorded as a requirement on your inventory report. So again, in the application, in your enrollment year, in your first application year, that's a physical inventory that's required. Then at least every 2 years, you'll require a physical inventory. In the interim of that, you can produce a cited inventory by a producer, but validated by your accredited veterinarian or your game farm investigator. So we reference it as a kind of a paper inventory, although you're supposed to know that you have the exact number of animals on a piece of paper as you have in the field, but you can conduct that yourself and simply have your accredited vet sign off that that's their understanding of the inventory in that given year. In your enrollment year, you of course send us a starting inventory. In every subsequent year from there ever after, we require an additional inventory, but in the subsequent years, those inventories have to be reconciled. And so what that means in terms of what you have to provide in information is if you have a new animal in that herd, and if it's not born in the herd, then you need a name, address of the person from whom it was obtained, and a copy of the proof of herd status, especially if it's from another province and not from Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, or Quebec. If it comes from a herd in that jurisdiction, although we would like you to send us the information of the status, so you ask the person you buy it from what status they are in the program and approve it, which would be a good thing to do anyway, because different people have various understandings of what program they're participating on. But if they're any of those 4 jurisdictions, then we have the capacity to cross-reference inventories. If they're coming from another province, you're going to have to provide that from their administrator. If you have animals that are not on the current inventory or the subsequent inventory that were on the first, you have to reconcile that, so the date they left the herd and where it went, the reason it left the herd, so did it die on the farm, was it sold, or did it go to slaughter, we should have been included in here, or did it escape, which we'll talk about too, I think. And then reconciling documents to prove all of that. So it's if you've purchased an animal, well, we've already talked about the status of proof of status, but if you've purchased an animal, it's not enough to say I bought it from so-and-so. It's going to have some reconciling documentation about how and where one would contact that person. And the same to be said of animals that are sold. And if they were required to be tested, which we'll talk about surveillance in a moment, then we'll have to have proof that they were in fact tested for CWD. See, dry as could be. There's nothing fun about this. Okay, surveillance requirements in the program. There's 2. The program historically had a requirement, and it still does, that all cervids 12 months of age or older that die or are humanely euthanized or hunted on farm have to be tested for CWD. That continues to be the same. And then in last year, in the revision of the national standards, there was the inclusion of some slaughter surveillance requirements for enrolled herds. And that was that in the 2018 calendar year, 50% of the slaughtered on farm or at an abattoir, including U.S. abattoirs, animals had to be tested. In this calendar year, 75% of those going to slaughter have to be tested, and in 2020, 100% of those going to slaughter have to be tested. If you have questions, you're welcome to throw up a hand at any point, because there's lots to go. Or shout out, throw something at me to get my attention. Any questions about surveillance? Okay. There's a little bit more to information and requirement in the last iteration of the national standards around the surveillance piece. It used to be a matter of simply getting to your next annual reconciliation where you would tell us how many animals died and send us the test results. And that's changed a little bit this year. Right now, if you have an enrolled producer is required to submit a quarterly on-farm death report. That is just a form that we provide you if you're on the program. The number of forms is absurd, honestly, but I digress. And we'll talk about maybe at some point how we'd like to digitize those and not talk about the sheer number of forms. But to make it easier, we have provided a template form which an enrolled producer would submit quarterly. The dates are on that form of the animals that have died on the farm, and it has the columns in it of the information that you need to collect, so some ID information and date of death. And we have actually asked, even if you don't have an on-farm death in a quarter, to submit it with a simple 0 on it. And I'm gonna, when I talk about CFIA disease responses, maybe that will become a little bit more clear as to why we would need to know it if there weren't any. So originally, when we started administering the program, we indicated that if you don't have any deaths and there's nothing to report, we don't necessarily need a report. And we're kind of revising that through this learning curve. That it would be a good idea to submit them with a 0 on a quarterly basis. Samples from those animals that die, if they're chilled or frozen within 36 hours, those samples are generally viable. And it used to be last year or in previous iterations of the national standards where you could simply toss them in a freezer for a long period of time when your annual reconciliation was coming along. You could send them in and test them as a batch and have them ready to go in with your report. That's not the case now. The national standards require that they are submitted in a timely fashion for testing following death. That's not prescribed in the number of days. But I can tell you that if folks in the future or down the road who are enrolled find themselves in a situation where they're part of a disease investigation, whether they're on farm or traced in or traced out, that sort of information, in other words, when they died versus when and how long they've been sitting in the freezer if they're still on the farm, or when they were submitted, will be taken into account when they're assessing eligibility for compensation. So even though I don't have a specific time, I'm going to encourage everybody to really keep on top of getting those sent in shortly after they've died. And then unsuitable samples, there's of course concern over unsuitable samples for testing, whether or not the product would, the OBEX and are we still just doing OBEX for CWD, or is it lymph node too?
Lymph node for I think it's both, but
Both.
it's lymph node preferred, and elk it's OBEX preferred.
Okay.
So.
Sorry, because we also do the Scrapie program. We've just updated the standards there to require the inclusion of 2 tissues sampled per dead animal. So anyway, so if the sample has been cultivated, collected on farm or in the vet, and they make it to the lab and they're unsuitable for testing, that's going to be an issue. And we've had situations in the past where people have indicated that simply, it died and got buried in the snow and I don't have a sample for it, didn't find it in time, didn't find it to the melt off, and I didn't get it tested in a timely fashion. And then when I found it, the sample couldn't be tested. The last iteration of the program rules has some very specifics around how often that can happen and be forgiven, so to speak. So there's now if you kind of go through our standard operating procedures, and I'll show you where to find that information later, it will give you a bit of a flow chart as to what the implications are of unsuitable samples over time. There's very less tolerance for losing them. There is the ability to compensate a certain number of animals to replace a lost or unsuitable sample so that you don't suffer a penalty assessment in terms of your status on the program, or you can opt to not replace lost samples with sacrificed animals. However, you will find yourself in a situation where you lose status as a result of it. And sacrifices cannot be used to overcome repeated submissions of poor quality samples. So we just talked about how you can sacrifice a certain number of animals. And I say a certain number like it's really vague and I don't know. It's not that specifically. It's that the number of animals is dependent on what level you've achieved already in the program. So if you're below a level, I think it's below a level A or below, then it's 2 animals for every 1 lost. If it's certified, it's 1 for 1 lost. And so you can find that in the SOP, we'll speak to it. And we will, as many of you may know, in working with us, we are not completely, what's the word I'm looking for? We're not completely impossible to work with, right? So we understand that situations happen, and we try to assess risk accordingly and be flexible. I've been called a lot of things in my life. Perfect has never been one of them, and so I don't expect to hold anybody else to that sort of standard. If you have situations where you'll have a 1-off or a 2-off where it has happened because of one of those situations, like a tremendous amount of snow where you couldn't get it sampled, you simply couldn't find the animal, then we'll work with you. If it becomes, I've got 2 hands, so 1 second. If it becomes a situation where this is a repeating issue, it becomes a concern, and if you think of it from a matter of assessing the level of risk, which is what this program is designed to do, right? It's to help you detect whether you have a risk on your farm, and it's designed to assess that level of risk. From a status assessor's, and I'll maybe speak for the CFIA and even a CFIA perspective, if you have lots of animals that are dying and not heads being submitted to validate that they didn't die from CWD, they died from something, right? And 1 or 2, a 1-off where they're buried in snow is one thing. But to suggest that that happens a lot and frequently, and you're going to sacrifice an animal to replace it, there's always that question of, are you really, or are you sacrificing an animal that had some other sort of suspicious death? And I don't mean to sound unkind when I say that, but that's really that thought process that goes through whether or not you allow that sacrifice piece to be a mechanism that you fall back on frequently for missed samples. The questions are rolling in.
Okay. We are about to embark on a program where we are antemortem testing using ram-alt tests. Will that data be able to be inputted into this program?
The national standards as they currently exist don't accept ram-alt testing as a substitute or screening test for CWD. And because I don't establish the standards on which the program is established, the CFIA assesses the science relevant to that. I can't speak to whether or not they will or will not in the future. What I can tell you, if it's any spark of hope, perhaps, and maybe I'm exceeding it and making people hopeful where maybe there shouldn't be, but we have also managed the Scrapie program for probably 15 years now, and we've seen the science supported in those program rules evolve over time to change the actions that are taken on different farms based on more than just Scrapie testing a brain or a lymph node. So ram-alt testing can be used in screening. And even just as recently as a year ago, we implemented a live animal testing protocol based on RAML testing as an alternative, not to testing, but as an alternative to minimum 1 animal tested per year requirement that program has to stay on or advance. And so that science has evolved, and the understanding and the appreciation of the accuracy of that science has evolved over time. And likewise, the genetic piece, I was going to throw my hand up yesterday when y'all were talking about genetics, because that too has become something that with enough validation of the science, the CFIA has accepted, and even from a Scrapie perspective internationally, when it was never, genetic resistance or susceptibility was never a means of assessing risk, we see increasingly other countries validating that it in fact is. You need lots of samples and you need research to back that up before the CFIA considers putting it into a program. But my piece of advice as a lobbyist, for, to get things accomplished for our sector with the CFIA is that keep pushing that as an opportunity and finding ways to encourage sample collection to be used for evaluating and assessing the technology. The DNA, I'm digressing way off my slides because they're so regulated based, and I'm not a fan of regulations. I'd rather talk about fun stuff than talk about that per se. But we were talking about the genetic resistance yesterday, for example. And I know the CFI is not always the easiest to work with, but we had developed a scrapie eradication plan a number of years ago. In that, we identified a lack of understanding of genetic resistance in goats. And we said to the CFI, we don't know, what the genetic markers are, if any, that convey resistance or susceptibility to scrapie in goats, but we know it's in sheep. So clearly, it's a thing, right? Clearly, it's something that exists. And what do we do to further that? And the challenge we had was not just that we didn't have that information in our country. No country had that information. At which the CFIA could look at it and say, oh yeah, you're right, in such and such a country they understand that this is the genetic resistance. That wasn't the case. But a couple of years after we identified that as a need in terms of research, and as a way of helping us get rid of the disease and improve the health of herds, we had some scrapie outbreaks in goats. And at least the CFIA was forward-thinking enough to collect genetic samples from depopulated animals. Right? So animals on one farm where you've got positives and you've got negatives, and pull not just the OVEC samples but genetic samples and start looking for similarities and markers between the animals that were positive and the animals that were negative. So as much as lobbying the CFI is not easy to do, if you want to find a way that you can find some common ground, if you go to them now and say, we want you to accept genetic resistance and susceptibility as a way of managing the disease, the answer is going to be no. But if you go to them and say, this is a research need that we have, there's research out there around it. If we could get more samples in our setting, if we can get those collected when animals are being depopulated on these various farms and correlating the positive animals versus the negative animals, can we do it? You might get more willingness to participate in that. I mean, if nothing else, it will make them look good. Sell it like that. You'll look really good if you find this and no other country has really determined it with any validity. And so they've done a lot of work for us in that research field. I digress way off. So will they accept the RAML testing? Not now. Do we foresee it in the next iteration of it? No. Has it been a discussion? It's been tossed around, I think, at the CFIA level. But I never see a move from the CFIA unless they can really, really validate the science in a Canadian setting. That's the key. So if you nobody has research dollars, I don't have any, but if you had research dollars that you want to put into something, focus on a couple of things like that, technologies that'll be useful. And I bet with a little finessing, you could talk them into that sort of thing. And I can put you in touch with who's in charge of research projects.
We're starting.
Yeah.
It's coming, so we're sending out the warning shot that it's coming.
Okay, well, I don't think warning shot was the way to finesse them into it, but something, a well-worded warning shot might be helpful. There was another question in my ramblings.
Not mine, sorry.
Go ahead.
The unsuitable samples, okay? What I'm hearing from you sounds to me like it would work really great if I had 30 animals on 1/4 of land with not a tree on. But I'm running 200 to 300 head on 4/4 of bush pasture.
Mm-hmm.
Is it going to go by a percentage base? Are you going to look at me and say, okay, Todd, you've got 300 head and you had quite a few you couldn't find this year?
No.
Or are you going to look at me and compare me to the guy that has 10 animals in a nice little pen that he can keep an eye on.
Yeah, in previous iterations, it was based on a percentage, so it had to be 80% of the animals tested. And now it's not. It's based on simple numbers. So for every sample lost to inventory, I think it's terminology we frequently use, you have those options. You have a couple options. One is you replace them with a cohort and test that animal, which could be a slaughtered animal in and around the same time to replace the lost samples. And the other one is to take a status hit on your participation based on the lost animals. Now, there are exemptions in the program. I don't even know if I put them on here. There we go. There are some exemptions. So if they're an animal lost to predation, for example, so the coyotes get it or the bears get it, then you can validate that, and we do this in the sheep industry because we have lots lost to predation in sheep. I mean, when they haven't figured out a way to kill themselves, they figure out to find something that'll kill them really quickly. But where somebody's only just taken a picture of a head, and we've had that in our CWD program in Ontario as well. Somebody's like, look, all we found was the head with one ear and the ear tag left, and the other ear tag something ate. But a picture of that validated that exemption for the loss. So the difficult answer is if they're just lost because they're in the bush and there's a lot of snow and we can't get to them, not on a consistent basis, would that be accepted in the program? And you have to understand, like, I know it's easy for me to excuse it away and say that it's the CFIA's rules and I can't do anything about it. But the reality is, think of me for a moment, but once a year, 4 CFIA people come into my office and they pull your files. And they look through every single piece of paper and they sit in the corner of my office and they whisper about all the things I may have done wrong in delivering the program. And even if I didn't do something wrong, they're going to make sure that the status that we assessed is in keeping with the rules that they set. So I can't say, I'll give you a pass on this one, because the CFIA will overturn that pass if I didn't assess it based on the standards. So I'm not trying to excuse away that I can't be completely flexible, but I can't be completely flexible. So anyway, that's the reality of how this program, this partnership and program delivery works. I administer it against rules that I don't set, and then I get assessed against whether or not I did it based on those rules. I mean, the good news is that we got audited in January. I don't know if that's really good news, but it is why they sell wine in a box and not just little tiny bottles. Anyway, but we did get assessed for our delivery of the program, and aside from a few little administrative notes, we haven't contravened our administration of the program. And I mean little things like, I didn't check on a veterinarian's accreditation. Well, I didn't check on it because 2 days before we assessed the status of the farm, I asked the CFIA for a printout of the accredited vets, and I knew who it was, but I didn't actually send an email for every single file that said was the vet accredited on that specific day. So the little things like that. But there have been instances in the past, I think in this jurisdiction, and I've known of others, where a status assessor has said, we would let it pass, and the CFIA in an audit said, no, we don't, and they'll strip that status away. So that leaves me comfortably between the middle of both of you.
So how many heads could you miss? Like, how many heads, like if you missed 2 or 3 a year, is that acceptable?
No.
1?
Well, you have to replace the one. Depends on if it's not an exempted loss, then your 2 options in any missed heads is a replaced animal. So we would say a sacrificed animal, but the reality still is that you could actually use a slaughtered animal. So let's say you lost 3, but you got 5 going to slaughter. Well, let's use 6. You've got 6 going to slaughter. You need to test 3 of those for your slaughter surveillance. You can use your other 3 to replace your lost inventory. So the options are replace lost, and how many you use to replace the loss depends on the level that you're at, or you take a hit on your program status.
Okay, so how long do you have? You got a whole year to submit a head? Like I don't
To replace an animal?
Yeah, I already get
In the current national standards you do. And so in the current national standards, that need to replace them is not assessed until the end of the year. And likewise, the animals that you can use, so let's say you don't want to sacrifice animals to replace them, which clearly you don't. You want to instead send in surveillance samples instead of sacrifice samples to say this is to replace my lost ones. You can do that from any slaughtered animal within that calendar year.
Okay, let's
Okay?
go back to my herd here for a minute. Let's just
Okay.
say, like, every year I ship about a semi-load, 45 animals roughly.
Okay.
Or slaughter. So if I had 3 animals that I couldn't find just somewhere in all them trees I have, are you saying I'm okay?
No.
No.
If,
So I don't
unless you could
understand
prove that they were exempted, then you have to replace them with a sacrificed animal. And for the time being, that sacrificed animal could be a slaughtered animal result.
So out of the 45 that I ship for slaughter, I test all the heads.
Not, right now, we're not at 100%
No, I
slaughter
do, though.
surveillance.
We do.
You know, so yes, so one of the, well, it depends on what level you're at.
Certified.
If you're at a level that, if you're level certified, then it's a 1-for-1 replacement.
Okay.
So if you've lost 3 and you send 45 to be slaughtered, and you don't have to use all 45 for your slaughter surveillance, and you have 10 left over, then 3 of those replace your 3 lost.
Thank you.
On a calendar basis for right now. Yeah.
Corlena, on the last call that we had, there was discussion that they would allow for slaughter animals within a 3-month period.
Correct, so that's,
Okay.
when we,
Listed.
Months.
so when we get to what's being proposed for the future ones, I'll talk about what it is. So that's why I made very clear, the way the standards are now, that is something that you're eligible to do. And then we'll talk about what, and right now I can only talk about what's in the program rules. I can't talk about, I can tell you what's proposed in the program rules, but the comment period for those hasn't ended. And the last iteration of those I haven't seen. So it's not for me to say that these, in 3 months, these will absolutely be the rules, right? But I have some slides to speak specifically to it. Surveillance exemptions, destruction by fire, destruction by carrying away by predator, theft. This happens more probably in sheep than elk, I would suggest. And losses or destruction of a sample no longer in control of the farmer, owner, or operator. So there are instances where samples will get left in a delivery truck overnight. That's a sample outside of your control. If it gets lost because of that reason, it's an exempted loss. And any other reason over which the owner operator has no control, so and has to be validated by an appropriate third party. And this one has, I'm not going to say it. Well, we've had instances where folks have been away and they've lost an animal and really don't even know what happened to it, but they could demonstrate that and you're not supposed to do this. You're supposed to have somebody managing the farm who does that appropriately for you and understands that if an animal dies, or if you've got one less animal, you need to know where it is, what happened to it, where its head is. But we have in the past, and this is the part that I'm going to get a hand slap for, had instances when folks were away and they couldn't manage what happened, or there was some escape and they couldn't manage what happened to the head and weren't able to submit it. Don't tell me that that's the case in writing. But that's one of those an appropriate third-party losses. So surveillance samples missed, levels E through A, 2 animals, 12 months or older for every missed sample. If you're certified, 1 animal for every missed animal. And failure to compensate for missed samples. So this is where I said you don't have to slaughter an animal to replace it, but you take a status hit. And this is what that status hit is. 1 missed sample that you don't replace, you're downgraded by 1 status level. 2 missed samples to 50% of your missed samples, you're downgraded 2 status levels. And if you miss more than 50% of the samples, then your status hit is 3 status levels. Yeah.
So how many status levels can you go down before they punch you off the program?
Well, they go down to level E, so you go back to the starting point.
And then are you still on the program at a level E forevermore?
Yep. For that year, you are. So you go down from any level down to level E.
So I could go on the program, not submit some heads, get to a level E and stay on the program?
For 1 year and not continually, but I am going to talk to you in a moment about the changes the CFIA is making to their compensation. So if your sole purpose is to be on the program for the sake of compensation, as of April 1, you wouldn't be eligible at a level E for compensation.
How about exporting, like from Alberta to Saskatchewan?
I don't-
Be at a certain level?
I don't know what the interprovincial requirement is. Connie, can you speak to that? Is it level certified?
I didn't hear what.
The question is to export into Alberta from Saskatchewan Do you have to be at a certain level, or maybe the?
Okay, so export to Alberta, you need to be, we look at the compliance with the provincial mandatory surveillance program, and it's 90, for regular slaughter, it's 90% of heads submitted is what their standard is.
No, if I want to bring animals to Saskatchewan to a hunt ranch.
Yes.
I just wondered what level I should be, and the gentleman said level C.
Yes, equivalent to B, I think. Equivalent to B, but you don't actually have to be on the herd certification program. We can look at your herd records, and we get information from Alberta with your permission, and as long as it would be equivalent to level B on the program, that's good enough. You don't actually have to be on the program, but you have to have records that show that submissions, that you would meet those conditions if you were on the program.
And then to the question about, could you go down to level E in a year? Yes, you can go down to level E in a year. If you went down to level E 3 years in a row because you weren't sampling, the CFIA is going to remove you from the program.
Yeah, well, you realize that some of us, no matter how we try, we're not gonna get all our heads. We have a couple animals die every year, and we don't know they're dead for 6 months.
I do.
So,
I do realize that.
so is there any hope for somebody like that to be on this program and stay there?
No, not very likely, no.
And then I still don't have it clear, the sacrifice. Could I go shoot a couple
Yes.
and within the year?
Right now, it's within the year.
But it's coming, it's gonna be within 3 months.
Yes.
So I could move a bull to a hunt farm and submit its head, and that would qualify as a sacrifice?
Is your hunt farm on the program?
No.
Normally when you would move them off the program, are they indicated as sold if they move from your enrolled farm to your hunt farm? Yeah, Connie?
Yes.
Then no. Not if they're sold. If you shot them on the farm and they were tested it's considered an on-farm death or slaughter, then it's testable. Yep, Connie.
Sorry, I just totally lost my train of thought here. It was the, go back to it.
What you're talking about.
Okay, well, we had talked about them as samples, and I get it, look, I do get it. It's not other than administering it, it's not my program. You know what I mean? I don't make the rules, and as much as I make efforts to advocate the difficulties enrolled producers have with complying with program regulations, my impact is only limited, right? If what you need is a fundamental change in disease control measures or compensation measures or some level of program that allows all those things, I'm not the person to help. And I don't mean that as an easy out, but I mean that is, I don't establish those rules. Yeah.
I just remembered it. What it is if you're taking an animal as your sacrifice animal on your inventory, where it says animal 1, 2, 3, whatever, next, because that animal didn't have a proper, or is showing missing now, you would write in there sacrificed using 3, 4, 5, or whatever, that you
Correct.
Correlate the two on your inventory.
Yeah, but that's just a matter of reconciling the information. I don't think that responds to that element of, if I sell the animal and it goes somewhere else, then I kill it, does it count for an enrolled farm if it was actually technically no longer part of the enrolled farm? Now, government folk, Betty, plug your ears. Because what I would do in an instance like that, if it was on your last inventory, and I saw it was dead on this date, and I saw a test result, and there was no movement permit required to move it from your breeding stock farm to your hunt farm, I don't know how I reconcile that information. I see one animal that's on inventory, and then I see a test result. But do you need a permit here in Saskatchewan to move them, even from if you had a permit that indicated it moved from the farm and it was alive, it doesn't count as your sacrifice. If it was sacrificed on the farm, shot to be used to replace the sample, then in fact, that's a sacrificed animal for it. But if there's a movement permit that suggested it moved off the farm and it died after that, it can't be considered on that farm for the purposes of replacing the lost inventory animal.
Something that should be taken into consideration is with cervids, elk, deer, whatever, ideal pasture for them includes quite a bit of trees.
Mm-hmm.
you guys are talking about sheep, cattle, things that could be on a wide open pasture at any time. And I think there should be just maybe a little bit of a broader area for us because we have bush pastures.
So there's folks in this room who represent the industry when it comes to sitting down with the CFIA to determine program rules. And those are the folks, and I'm not trying to pass the buck, but when the issue with the implementation and delivery of the program is that from an administrative standpoint, so from a paper, I know this sounds like I sound like government now, even though I say I'm not. If it's a paperwork problem, that's the sort of advocacy I do for enrolled producers, right? But I'm not the sheep, I'm the sheep industry, I'm not the cervid industry. I'm happy to take up the cause, but like I said earlier, if it's a fundamental change, that has to be a cervid industry ask. Because I'm pretty sure if I tried to advocate for some change in the program that was much further reaching into the impact on how you as a cervid industry did business, that'd be a huge liability for me. Who the hell does she think she is talking about what I need as a deer elk producer because all she knows is sheep. Now I know a little bit more than sheep, but not much more. And so that's not my position. I've tried to kind of clearly delineate those so I also don't unfairly advocate against producers, but that's the role of your industry and your industry representatives. So I'll get on my high horse because this is not where I make most of my money, but I did sit through some of your CCA meeting yesterday. Those are the guys that sit at all the big tables. Those are the folks that need supporting if you want them to advocate and lobby for industry. And let me tell you, lobbying for industry is like poking yourself in the eye with a pencil every single day. But if you do it every single day, sometimes you get a change. And so it takes those folks to argue on your behalf. And so in my industry, they call me a bulldog. I'll be that here sometimes too if I can and where I can, and I can bring it up. And even that idea of using a slaughtered animal to replace a lost inventory animal was something that I fought for because it didn't make sense to have just have all these slaughter samples that weren't serving some sort of a purpose. But when we get to the point where you need 100% slaughter surveillance, then we've kind of run out of those extra samples that aren't doing any good otherwise. I shouldn't say that. They're doing a lot of good. They're testing for CWD, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I don't want to beat this to death, but I think these questions are the same as the question I have is that top line on there looks like simple math, 2 animals for every missed sample. So getting back to shipping a semi-load to slaughter and testing them all. So if I ship, like in his case here, 45 animals, or so let's say 20 animals, does that mean I can have 10 lost samples? Because
Well, I
2 for 1?
I wouldn't math it backwards. I wouldn't recommend mathing it backwards.
Well, math it forwards then.
Yeah.
If I lose 10 animals and I ship 20, that fits that top line?
It will. I'll go back to my previous one that says, no, 2 others. Sacrifices can't be used to overcome repeated submission of or lost samples. So
Well, in 1 year that would work then,
Yes,
but not
that would.
year after year.
Correct.
Okay, okay.
I find wiggle room where wiggle room is permitted in the system.
Okay.
So yes, I would. And we've had in a previous year, producer get all the way to the end of their program year and not have either of those. They didn't slaughter any that year, and they also had 2 samples that they had to sacrifice. And we waited till the end of the year for them to make that decision and the alternative of losing the status. So, you know, in a situation like that, wait while you can till the end of this program year, unless that changes in the next iteration. Okay, you can chase me down in the hallway with a few more sample selection questions because I want to roll right along to, and I don't mean to disregard the questions. Anybody who knows that if they call and leave me a message or shoot me an email, I generally get back to them, and then the conversations are super lengthy and very explanatory, so you're always welcome to do that as well. Okay, site plans. With the enrollment year and the first advancement year after the new advancement year after the new standards, they're in place now, so now it's your enrollment year. You need to provide a site plan. So if you're artistic, which I am not, you can hand do it. Google Maps works. For our young people, Google Earth is even super awesome because it actually shows all your buildings and your fences and your driveway and the water, all that kind of neat stuff. Any of those versions of the site plan works. And then just take a Sharpie and draw out your feed storage and your water sources, locations of fence in proximity to other farm cervids, and then fencing sufficient to prevent intrusion or escape, and inspection and reported annually. So we're going to go over the biosecurity plan, and it has an element of that where these things have to be inspected and validated. Biosecurity, and this is, so we talked already about it, and I'd said, you know, the biosecurity requirements we had, ours is not a biosecurity plan, it's a biosecurity forum and an element within the program pretty focused on the biosecurity risks of CWD. It's one of those many forms which your accredited vet has to validate and sign, and it's going to look for biosecurity around a few things. Feed storage, making sure it's inaccessible by wild cervids, excuse me, including farm-grown, post-harvest, and prohibited materials inaccessible to cervids. That means if you've got non-ruminant feed on your farm, keep it away from cervids. I don't know if folks knew this, know this. My previous life was in as a feed specialist, one of the salesmen you wanted to shoot coming through the door, but you can feed what would otherwise be banned materials for ruminants to non-ruminants. And so you have to make sure that if you've got pig food or chicken food or horse feed, dog food, cat food, those sorts of things on your farm, you're keeping it away from your ruminants. Okay, so keep it away from your deer. You laugh, but I used to have this cow that I used her as an embryo recip frequently, and if she would escape, a bag of cat food is what always got her back. Not the best piece of advice ever, but anyway. So they will go for that and eat that stuff like candy. You could just walk down the road and find her, shake the bag, and she'd come following you back for some cat food. Keep them away from it. It has to be inaccessible on the farm. But that's a good biosecurity plan for CWD or anything else. Standing water used for farm cervids must be inaccessible to wild cervids, and running water or spring runoff is not regulated. So if you have just seasonal movement of water through pastures, I don't think we're managing that currently, right? Right. Only if it's standing water. So biosecurity relative to taxidermy and carcasses. No carcasses or parts from wild cervids or farm cervids of no status are allowed on farm where they can come in contact with enrolled farms or enrolled cervids. There is an element, though, that if you can ensure they're kept separate, it's permitted for personal use only when farm cervids do not have access, and permitted where there is a processing facility physically separate from live farm cervids. In other words, you can bring them home if you've got a processing facility, if you can ensure that there's some biosecurity measures between those locations and your farm cervids. Biosecurity around transportation vehicles. They have to be thoroughly cleaned, power washed or scrubbed with low pressure water, detergent, and a brush for animals transported off the premises and returned, and then cleaned upon return. Transporting lower or no status animals cleaned before returning to the VHCP premise, and periodic washing of farm vehicles. You're going to see some changes in this in the upcoming changes, just because not everybody's been paying much attention to the farm vehicle piece, and not always validating some of your own movements with your own trailers. And then collect and dispose of organic material escaping vehicles with lower or non-status cervids. So it's really ensuring there's no organic material and none comes off in your farm or in your surroundings. Yeah.
So if I'm shipping my own animals, come home with my trailer, it doesn't have to be disinfected?
I don't believe it's disinfected if there's no commingling or mingling of lower or non-status animals on the trailer. It does need to be cleaned and power washed. Organic material is the suggestion, but not cleaned and disinfected. And then there was a requirement in the new national standards that farm vehicles, so tractors, for example, feeders, and other sort of equipment that might move onto non-fenced areas and fenced areas had kind of a periodic cleaning throughout the year, removal of organic material. From my perspective, that's a really hard piece to validate, quite frankly. I don't know if the vets in the room have a similar challenge. I know that with some initial enrollments, you took a picture of a clean trailer and wrote out a protocol, and there is an area in the biosecurity form to explain what your protocol is and your that biosecurity process for cleaning and disinfecting, but we'll see some changes around it. Did you want to add to that, or are you okay?
I'm okay with that. The one thing that I did run into was
people leaving bales out in the field till January before they brought them into the protected area in the
Okay.
yard. And that's a real risk because wild elk love to climb on those and pee all over them and you name it. So get your bales off the field and behind the fence as quick as you can.
Yeah, and there's supposed to be an element of those harvested feeds to be stored that way, but there isn't a time frame during which it's expected that that happens, and so it's a very good observation. And I'm going to talk, when we talk about the CFIA disease control measures, about promptness of doing these things that you're supposed to do. Okay, this is ugly. We have, there's an intrusion and an escape protocol for enrolled farms. So what do you do if you have an escaped, and I don't know which one this is. This is escaped cervids. I don't expect you to read it from here. This is available in our SOP. I would just suggest printing it a little larger than this so you can read it. And I know provincially you have some specific, and every province is slightly different in the regulations around what happens if you have a farm cervid escape into the wild, and what happens if you have a wild cervid come into your farm, right? We heard an anecdotal story about what that meant to one enrolled producer, or one producer yesterday. So we were required to somehow manage this, and the CFIA, like they do, say here's the program, how are you going to deliver it, and then we have to write out complicated little pieces that look like this. But this is a decision tree on what actions you take with respect to that escaped animal or the intruder has on your enrollment status, which is sometimes, I'll back up a step, provincial regulation prevails. Whatever your provincial regulation says you have to do in that case, that's what you do. But in some jurisdictions where there's a lax approach to escapes and intrusions, then this decides on what happens in your status on your program. I'm not going through it. Sorry, I'll show you where to find it on our website, and I'm happy to print them off and send you copies if you prefer. But it's just to say that that these decisions in status assessment based on these sorts of events are mapped out because we have to map them out, right? CFIA wants to know well in advance, in other words, for the whole year, if this thing happens, what are you going to do to assess the status? And that's what these decision trees tell you. Multiple premises, so there's some definition of national standards about multiple premises. They must have the same certification as belonging to the same owner and they're contiguous. So if it's one plot of land altogether, that's one farm for enrollment purposes. You may have the same status if you're non-contiguous, so if you have two properties across the road or down the way from each other, provided that the owner and operator, the same owner and operator, and they're both maintained at the same status level. So that if you do something on one farm that impacts the status there, then now you're impacting the status across the board. To be considered non-contiguous, they must be separated by a buffer zone. That one is left to our discretion to a certain extent, what that might mean. So if the question was, I've got one farm here, and I've got one big giant plot of land, but that piece over there has never had farm cervids on it, but I want to put farm cervids on it. But this farm has a status, and either that one's going to start off with no status, or I want to buy animals with advanced status and put them on that farm, or on that plot of land further down the road on my farm. Can they have an advanced status? Are they considered the same farm? Am I stuck with the same regulations? So if there's a buffer zone between those, then there's some options to be considered multiple non-contiguous premises. And they may have different statuses provided individual biosecurity. So in that one I just mentioned, so let's say you've got one farm, it's at level D. Somebody's certified, they're going out of business, you want to buy the whole herd, you want to start that herd down there, it's never had farm cervids on it ever before, and you want to fence it off, it's never been fenced, and I want to keep the status with that animal. Then we also have to look at what is your biosecurity plan for all the equipment you're using on that one piece, one enrolled herd versus that other enrolled herd, because we just talked about the biosecurity risk of equipment and all the organic matter on the equipment, and so there's some element of that environmental risk and not just the animals and where they came from or where they're sitting. So you can be different, you can have the same piece of large property, two separate looking operations, in other words a buffer zone between the two, and provided that you can demonstrate biosecurity of equipment, staff, and people on one, and the other we can consider multiple enrollments. So I had this, we kind of brought this up last year, and I had somebody to suggest we issue a reminder to folks. There's an enrollment process. It's as complicated as the advancement process. In fact, it's the same process. You have to understand the national standards and ensure your ability to comply with them. It's a voluntary program. I mean, I get that the CFIA is making it increasingly de facto mandatory, but it is still voluntary. But understand what the program rules are before you get on it. Save yourself the time of having the vet come out, the game farm investigator come out, do an inventory and sign all your accreditation documents and get that all submitted to us, only to find that you can't stay on the program because you can't follow the program. The program, I shouldn't say you don't, that the program rules don't fit your management. I'm not making any assessment of the value in which you manage your farms based on whether or not you can participate in this program. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying because you can't follow the program rules, you're not doing a good job. That's not at all what I'm saying. So it's not an assessment of your management practices. But for some people and how you do business and where you are and what your goal is, participating on the program, given its regulations, doesn't work for you. Just know that in advance. Read through the rules. Don't sign up because I want compensation and get a couple months down the road and then realize that that's simply not going to work. Because it's going to cost you a significant amount of dollars to go through the process. So understand the national standards and ensure your ability to comply. This is an aside, and I don't know if there's a lot of export that goes from Saskatchewan to the US, but in some of those jurisdictions, you can export to the States. And when you go to do that export permit, some USDA office is going to call me. Okay, we do it for any sheep export, and they also do it for any enrolled producer who wants to export. And they're going to ask questions not just about your program status level right now, but your history of involvement in the program. So you don't want to be suspended from this program if at some point down the road the hope is that there's an export opportunity, because that will come back to haunt you. So you're better off making that decision proactively about your ability to stay on the program or not stay on the program, advance through the years, because it has a bit larger reaching resounding effect. To get on the program, you have to do an initial inventory conducted by an accredited vet, an official vet, that's a provincial or federal staffed vet, or a game farm investigator, Renee, will do inventories to get you enrolled in the program, and you have to have conducted that inventory within 3 months of applying for the program and submitting your package. And then you complete and remit the appropriate lengthy list of forms. I remember back in the day when there was 5, and there are not 5 anymore. There are 14 forms, sorry in advance. But this is the list of them. There's forms, and I'm not going to go through the titles of all of them, but I will tell you where to find them, and I'm happy to mail you some. But I do encourage folks to visit the website. And each one of these has a role of validating some piece of information that has an associated requirement in the national standards. It's the way of ensuring that you're complying with the program. And it seems like a lot, but if you've completed them all, and all the blanks are filled in, then we have all the information that we need to put you on the program, and you have completed all of the information and the elements to be certain that you're following the program requirements. Fair enough? And then we assess entry level and assign you an anniversary date. So let program levels start at level E, they go DCBA and certified. Those are the program levels, and with each year of program compliance, you advance a level through the program. And when you enroll in the program, we'll send you a letter. It says, welcome to the program. Yay! Little music go off. And a certification thing, but most importantly, it has an anniversary date on it. There's one important element on that certificate, that's your anniversary date. So you've been assessed an anniversary date. It's the date you have to remember that next year at that date and time is when you need to start thinking about getting a new program file. And so things like compensation eligibility and export pieces and when your inventories are due next year are all based on that anniversary date. So when you get that calendar to put together your herd health plan, put a sticker on the anniversary date as a reminder that's coming up. And we try to adhere to a 30-day service standard. Remember, I'm not perfect, and we're not perfect. And getting you enrolled in the program is more than just you sending us a package of information and we say you're on the program. So we have background work that we have to do to validate some of the information that you send in, and that has to get done before we can put you on the program and assign that anniversary date. And so we tried to get that done in 30 days. Let me tell you, at the end of last March 2018, that was very hard to do given the number of files that suddenly showed up on March 29th for processing. So if you were in that bundle of folks and it took you more than 30 days to get the answer back, my apologies for that. But we got everybody who submitted an application enrolled and statused in time. Throughout the program year, once you're on the program, the job is not done. There's a few things that you have to continue to do through the course of the year and follow along to. That's remitting samples for CWD testing in a timely fashion. That sounds super vague. It's how the national standards read. So there's not a defined 3 days, 5 days, 10 days, but I wouldn't leave it months. So in a timely fashion. Collect movement permits and CW test results and keep them handy. I'm a bit old school. The gray hair is now giving it away. I'm embracing my old. I would do it in a paper format, throw it into a paper file every time you have a movement permit. I don't know what other purposes you keep them for. So maybe you need them for something else, but if you do, make a copy, throw it in a CWD file every time it happens. Because I need them all at the end of the year, and you probably don't want to be looking through a big giant pile of papers like I have at my place, which is everything that happened in a year lives right here. When it comes reconciliation time, I need all of those movement permits. It's probably best to keep them copied and in a file specific for CWD. And then of course the same with the test results. We used to get them directly from the lab, now we don't, and at the end of the day it's an enrolled producer's responsibility to get the paperwork to me. So I don't go chasing down labs for results, but I'll look for them from you. There is that on-farm quarterly death report with the dates on it, which you had to submit to let us know what died and when on the farm in that quarter. You have to send those to us quarterly, like I mentioned earlier. Even if they're empty, just send one that says none, nothing, or something clever to that effect, or a list of animals that have died. It doesn't have to be accompanied at that point in time by the test results. Okay, we'll reconcile the test results the next year's anniversary date when they come due. It just simply needs to be that report. So don't, say, oh, I'm going to be late with my report because I'm waiting for a test result. Send me what you got when you got it. Then we have escape and intrusion reports. We ask for you to submit those as they happen to let us know that you had an escape or an intrusion, and it's self-explanatory. It's all written out on it, the kind of information that we're looking for, because remember that decision tree where we have to assess your status based on what events took place relative to that escape or intrusion, and we'll do that kind of on the fly. And then complete and collect one Form 13. So there's a form that talks about, yeah, my truck was clean. It shipped animals off that were by themselves, or animals that were commingled, or it was somebody else's truck, it was my truck. Again, when you take a look at the form, it's simply a matter of it will ask you for certain information relevant to a transportation event that took place. Fill those out, again, as they go, because if it's not your truck and somebody else's truck, they need to sign elements of that form. It's hard to chase them down a year later and have them recollect what happened on that date 6 or 9 months ago. So have them done as it happens, put them in the file with those test results and the movement permits that they're related to, and I'll collect those at the end of the year. And then when that anniversary date does roll around, we go through the whole thing again. It's the same set of forms, it's the same requirement to do an inventory report, plus all of those forms that you collected here. I need copies of them with this annual report. And that's regardless of your status. So even once you get certified, the requirement to do your annual inventory or annual report is the same. Complete an inventory within 3 months of that anniversary date that we gave you, either side of that. 3 months before that anniversary date or 3 months after the anniversary date. Complete and remit the appropriate forms, then we'll assess status level, and it's a 30-day service standard. And this is the year for where our paperwork becomes lengthy, because we actually do go through every single animal from last year's report and this year's report one by one and make sure they're all there, and if they're not there on the list, that they have been reconciled with some document. So a movement permit, a test result or an exemption letter. We have, I mentioned earlier, we do this for the Scrapie program. We have farms that have 3,000 animals on them. We do it exactly the same way. So they have 3,000 breeding animals, which means that they have, well, what's the lambing rate? The weaning rate's about 1.8. So about 9,000 animals. So a person sits down and they go through the list that you send us with our electronic file, 124000635, whatever that 14-digit number is, check. And then we go through the next one. That's the story. And so that's the reconciliation process. If that 30-day service standard doesn't work, and if you have 3,000 head, you're not, 30 days could be a stretch. But we do go through it with that amount of thoroughness, and the CFIA sweeps in right behind us, and those 4 guys sitting in the office for 2 days do exactly the same process. Make sure that not a single one has been skipped yet.
Sorry, you're
Probably tired of hearing from you, but
No, no, go ahead.
when we do that inventory, Renee comes out, she verifies that every animal on my farm is my animal accounted for, the numbers are accounted for. Our local vet has to approve and sign that Renee did her job, and then those forms go to you, and you have to look at every animal and make sure that our vet signed accurately and that Renee did her job accurately.
Yeah, and how it compares to how everybody did that exact same job the year before.
Right. Much duplication, repetition.
There's a lot of checks and balances in that for sure.
It's not good enough that Renee signs that that inventory is accurate,
Well, I mean, she can sign that the inventory is accurate.
but she was there. She was there and read my tag numbers.
She was, but that doesn't reconcile the inventory against last year. And does Renee
Well, it
remember?
does.
No, it looks for the animals that are on your farm that year. What she's doing is she's looking at your inventory list, and she's
Yeah.
saying, you have 10 animals, and here's the 2 ID numbers, 20 ID numbers, here they are. This is what's on the farm, I sign that this is on the farm, I sign that this is your inventory. What the reconciliation process is it says, okay, are those the same 10 animals as they were last year? And do they have the same ID numbers? And are both those same numbers the same? And if there's a difference, if there was 9 animals last year and 10 this year, then what we have to do is say, where did animal number 10 come from? Was it a natural increase?
I think Renee does that. Because she has previous years.
No,
I do, but I am not the assessor. She's the assessor. I do it for the provincial program. And I
Right,
send
you do it
to
for the
yours.
provincial program, so the provincial program verifies that. And you verify it with the provincial program. The provincial program has all my slaughter and transport permits. It's all duplicated over and over.
It is.
Nobody trusts anybody.
okay. So I've been given my 5-minute warning by a man who looks like he could pummel me. So I'm going to go very quickly, and you can find me with your additional questions. So we talked about the advancement status. These were the program levels. We've talked about those. Program suspensions, producers could be suspended for failure to submit their annual report on time, not meeting the surveillance criteria, which we talked about. If you're under suspicion of CWD or part of a CWD investigation, the CFIA instantaneously contacts us and says suspend that producer until we render a decision. And then that escape and intrusion report had elements of suspension on it depending on what course of action that you took, and we outline that so you know in advance. You have an intruder on the farm and you want to decide what you're going to do with it. I know you have a provincial regulation, not everybody does, but if I decide to do this thing with it, what happens to my status? Probably good to know that ahead of time, hence the decision tree. And program non-compliance. So if we get a producer who year after year has the same issue and not meeting a requirement, that's going to fall under that program, repeated program non-compliance. Suspensions are now investigated in a timely manner. I don't know how it was done elsewhere, but generally ours were done with just a matter of reconciling numbers, but I realize that for some folks it's a result of a CFIA investigation, and that takes a long, long time, and maybe they've surpassed a year. So now in last year's iteration we had a maximum of 1 year suspension, so you're either revoked or we resolve the suspension within that time. And there's an appeal process. If you don't agree with our suspension, We'll put an appeal in, you can launch an appeal, and the process for that is outlined in the national standards, or you're reinstated. And if you're reinstated on the program, it's at whatever assessed level. So for our intensive purposes, it's like if you're reinstated, it's like nothing ever happened here, and we move on, unless there was a status penalty associated with it. You can get kicked off the program, revoked from the program. So if a suspension goes unresolved, so something happened, you didn't follow the program rule and you can't make it right, then that's what happens, subject to appeal as outlined in the national standards. And you can be revoked from the program and still re-enroll if you can demonstrate that we've kind of fixed the problem that caused the revocation in the first place, or it fixed itself. So these are the ones I really wanted to get to right at the end. This changes in CFIA disease response. The proposed change is that effective April 1 of this year, and has everybody received this notice to industry that went out by CFIA? Have you seen it? Have you not? Interesting. Not for me to send it out, but I was told it was sent out middle of March. Here's what it will read, or it reads on the website. Currently, CFIA will only offer Voluntary Herd Certification Program disease responses, including depopulation, with compensation to CWD infected cervid herds enrolled in the program and compliant at level D or higher. Generally, those herds will have participated in the program for 12 months. Of those eligible herds, the producer or operator will be able to opt out of the disease control action, so you can choose just not to continue with it. It will affect any ability to re-enroll in the future. Any herd infected with CWD and not enrolled in the program or not compliant at level D or higher will be subject to initial disease control measures only. They'll come in, Betty, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they'll institute a quarantine long enough to conduct or to figure out where your trace-ins or where your trace-outs have gone, and then they'll go along to those farms and they'll lift the quarantine. That's my understanding. Now, new in this response, hence my asterisks, asteri at the bottom, is that when we look at when we assess your files, we do it once a year, right around that anniversary date, and you send us the new one, right? You're going to send us your quarterly death reports. We're going to make a copy. We're going to put it in a file. We're going to look for anybody who didn't. We're going to remind them that you need to send them to us, and we'll get those in. But that actual assessment of all the program forms, your biosecurity and lines, your inventory been done, we do once a year. But there are elements of that you need to do throughout the year. Remember I said if a trailer's moving animals are on off the farm, it's subject to being cleaned based on the type of movement that's taking place, and that's all on the form. If you did this movement, you have to do this thing. If you did this movement, you have to do this thing. You're supposed to keep one of those for every truckload, right? The part about submit samples in a timely fashion if an animal dies. So now in a disease response, if you are enrolled in the program, the CFIA, whenever they call us to say that they have suspended you for disease investigation, is going to ask for your file. And they're going to assess program compliance from the last time we looked at your file until the day they ask for your file. So if some biosecurity, if your hay is out in the field in January and you haven't brought it in, and they'll go on the farm, because that's going to be part of the investigation, and they find your hay not fenced in, and it's January, you're not going to be eligible for compensation, even if you're on the program, and even if you reach that level. Because in the interim of us assessing your files and the vets going on your farm to validate that you followed the biosecurity assessments, if they can assess some intermediary non-compliance, you're going to risk your eligibility. Okay? So enrolled herds, keep your program compliance update. Get your samples in, put your quarterly reports in, make sure your biosecurities continue to be in place, make sure your trailers and equipment have been cleaned out as per the program requirements if they should show up on your farm on that day. National standards updates. There's a name change, Herd Certification Program. We did that in the Scrapie program last fall. It was for market access confusion, I guess. It didn't change that it's not going to be voluntary. Now, I know different people may have different views about what the implications are for this particular program. For our program, the Scrapie program, we did it specifically because the word voluntary confused our trading partners. Go figure. And it's still a voluntary program, so it didn't affect that actual nature of the program. Status animals transferred to newly formed herds, there's more parameters around that now. So it used to be you could buy like certified animals, start a new farm with a herd of a group of animals that you've bought from a certified farm and enroll and get their status provided, you know, there hasn't been farm cervids there, and you can prove a few other things. But now there's a maximum time limit. You can go between buying those animals and applying and getting the advanced status. So if you buy status animals but you leave it too long, you leave it 6 months or a year later, and you say, oh, I bought them a year ago, but I've followed all the program requirements since then. I've tested all my deads and done all these things. It's not going to work now. So there's a time limit. And there's some a premises history check required, if you will. A validation that, in fact, because previously you could do that. You could assume the status of purchased animals if they're not commingling with other ones, provided you're pretty sure there weren't cervids on the farm before. But now there's going to be more information that has to be collected about that premises specifically if you're going to apply for an advanced status. You can buy status animals and put them on pretty much any farm. You just don't get to keep the status, right? So. Embryos only from herds of equivalent or higher status. So Connie mentioned earlier, originally this looked like a semen in embryos, and there was some pushback on the semen piece, but the embryo piece is going to be the same. They have to come from a farm or an animal of an equivalent or higher status on the program. Otherwise, your whole herd gets downgraded by an embryo that doesn't meet that requirement. Program enrollment when repopulating previously infected premises, so there's going to be some elements of that. Right, so remember you can opt out of disease. So if your status on a farm, there's a disease investigation, they lift the disease control measures, and they do not declare you infected premises, then you can go back to how you were. If it's an infected premises, and you do all the cleaning and disinfecting, you can bring animals onto the farm, get back on the program, but you come at level E. If you opt out of disease control measures, or if you were not an enrolled farm and you didn't follow, and you can't demonstrate that you follow disease control measures, then you can't get back on the program right away. There's like a delay between identification of your status with respect to the disease and when you can get on. And there's some changes in anniversary dates. We've helped out a few folks where, and let's be honest, like a lot of people got on the program right in March last year, which means you have to do an inventory this year sometime between June sometime. But that had, a suggestion that some folks were trying to get inventory done when there's piles and piles of snow. So we've helped a few folks figure out how to work their way around that and move an anniversary quarter so that the next year they can do it during a better and more convenient or better weather time of year. So they've written in some opportunities to do that. Currently, the only way to do it is suspend you, put you off a quarter, get your information, reassess you a new quarter. So rather than doing that, the program allows for moving back anniversary dates to provide a new status. So we talked about the enrollment of CWD suspect or exposed herds. Another big one that's changed is detailed SOPs and proof of implementation of vehicle cleaning and disinfecting required with annual reports. So we talked about this piece about, there's a requirement to wash trailers moving animals, but there was also supposed to be a requirement about some protocol for cleaning farm equipment. But that hasn't always really been followed, and how do you even validate that? So there'll be some detail around how you validate that. See here, I told you where you could find this stuff on our website, and it's not even here. If you're looking for information about the chronic wasting disease, we have a page available. It's at our cansheep.ca website. Simply go under programs. You'll see chronic wasting disease as one of them. National standards are there. That's the government's rules. The SOP is there. That's how we deliver the program. It's long, but it also speaks to those decision trees about escaped animals and ingress animals, how we assess a penalty for missed animals lost to inventory, and all of the program forms are available from there as well. So you can download them directly from there and have them if you need them. We're happy to send them out to you by email, fax, and mail. And if for fun, this is a fun side story. If you want to have a fascinating conversation with a kid 13 or younger, describe a fax to them. I had my son in the office when a fax was coming in, he was like, "Mom, what's that noise?" I was like, "That's a fax machine." "What's a fax machine?" And then I explained it to him, and he looked at me like I had three heads because he didn't understand why you just didn't email it to somebody. Anyway, so you can send information by fax. We will have it, and people have done it. And we generally just collect information and put it in your file. If you need validation that we got it, please let me know that you got it. Just give me a call, and we'll follow up with you.
I got one question.
Sure.
How many farms in Saskatchewan enrolled in the program?
Don't know off the top of my head, to be frank, because I don't assess the files, but all the list of enrolled producers is available on that website too. So I'll look it up for you in a break, during the break, and I can tell you how many farms in each of the provinces of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec are on it.
I believe it's 18,
Could be.
somewhere in that range.
Okay. If there's no other questions, you can hunt me down in the parking lot shortly after this. Not kidding, I'm around until the end of the break and running for the airport shortly after. So come and find me with any questions, comments, or otherwise that you have. All right? Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.